Hey guys, today we're going to talk about some of the basics of the nervous system. I'm going to start with talking first about what a neuron is. A neuron is really defined in most textbooks by three things. It's defined by a cell body, okay, which a lot of times is referred to also as a soma, okay. It would be an axon, and it would be dendrites. Okay, an axon is the nerve fiber. Now the key thing, and this is really part of the key thing of a neuron in general, is that it has this axon. The job of the neuron, okay, is to send basically signals, right? It's to send electrical signals, which of course gets sent down the nerve fiber or axon. That is the key function of a neuron. Okay, now we've really got two, you could say, major types of cells or tissues, if you want to kind of think of it that way. In the nervous system, you've got the neuron, which again is really all centered around sending the signals, and then you've also got neuroglia. Okay, so these two would make up what we refer to as nervous tissue. Okay, nervous tissue is one of the four main tissue types. You've got nerve tissue, muscle tissue, epithelial tissue, and connective tissue. So one specialized tissue, again, because of how unique it is, it's able to be stimulated, it's able to send an electrical signal, and of course it's able at the end of the axon to secrete a neurotransmitter. So a neuron is, yes, an electrical signal or event that occurs, but there's also a chemical event that occurs as well. So it's a specialized tissue, and of course there's two parts, neuron and neuroglia. Now what in the world's neuroglia? Neuroglia are basically the cell types that protect and assist neurons. So we'll just put that right here, protect and assist neurons. And there are 6 neuroglia. I'm not going to list them all here, but I can quickly run through them. You've got 4 neuroglia, okay, that are found in the central nervous system. Those would be things like the oligodendrocytes, which make myelin, the astrocyte, which forms the blood-brain barrier, and it also deals with healing of damaged nerve tissue. You've got things like the microglia, which are monocytes. Those are some of the examples of the neuroglia. 2 over on the PNS side, and again, I'm not going to mention everything or list them all out, but one of the key ones over here on the PNS side is the Schwann cell. There's also a satellite cell as well, but the Schwann cell is a key one over on the peripheral nervous system side because it makes myelin as well. So myelin for the PNS side is made by the Schwann cell. Myelin over here on the central nervous system side is made by the oligodendrocyte. So these neuroglia have a special job, but they're not directly related to sending signals. Now, I want to focus more on the whole myelin thing for a minute. When we look at a neuron, and I'm just going to kind of try to draw the best I can a neuron here. A neuron, again, we defined it already. I'm going to do my best to highlight it here. Neurons basically got, like we said, it's got dendrites, it's got this cell body, which the cell body has a nucleus, okay, so think of that as like your control center. And then, of course, it's also got, an axon here. So, of course, the signal is always going to travel one direction. It's our axon, and picture the signal, the electrical signal, going this way, okay? And in many of the axons in our body, we have this sheath called myelin. Okay, so picture this blue sheath called myelin. So the question is, what does myelin do? Myelin is actually predominantly fat. It's actually predominantly cholesterol. That is a sheath, notice just around the axon. Okay, what does it do? It increases the speed of the electrical signal. So that's the key thing. Myelinated neurons, okay, are going to be much faster traveling signals. So think about it. Any of the motor pathways that we use for skeletal muscle, like I'm using my muscles right now, I'm using myelinated neurons. You know, if I touch something really, really hot, I'm going to pull my hand away very, very quickly. Think about it. That signal is going through sensory neurons all the way to my brain, or at least my spinal cord if it's a reflex. It's being processed very quickly, and then my motor neurons are telling me to move my muscle very quickly. That all happens, you know, in milliseconds, and that's because it's using myelinated neurons. Okay, so that myelin is very, very important. Myelination starts early on in fetal development, so this is obviously before a child is born. It does not complete formation until the late teenage years. So this myelination process is taking place for much of a person's, you know, early life, okay? So it's a very important concept. So what about unmyelinated neurons then? Unmyelinated neurons are going to be seen going to organs, and we're going to kind of draw that out in just a little bit, but we're going to see unmyelinated neurons directly connecting to organs, and they're going to be much slower. They're missing the myelin. Okay, so their signal transmission is going to be very slow, which makes sense because the organ operation and regulation, adjustment of organ function is a slow process, and it's by design, okay? Now, one other thing we can mention here is that the electrical signal actually jumps thanks to this myelinated, or this myelination, and it actually jumps from gap to gap to gap. Those gaps are called nodes of Ranvier, and this jumping process that again occurs in a myelinated neuron is called saltatory conduction. So that's something we witness or can see in a myelinated neuron, and that jumping is what speeds up the signal so quickly. Okay, so that's some key things right there, just to kind of start things off. Now, let's jump real fast because we want to talk a little bit more about the spinal cord and the brain and just some basics. I'm going to draw a transverse image here of the spinal cord. I'm going to do the best I can, but picture right here, again, not probably the best drawing in the world, but here's my spinal cord. I'm going to say that this is the posterior side. I'm going to say this is the anterior side. And what you're going to notice first is this area right here is referred to as gray matter. My drawing isn't really great, but this resembles a butterfly. You know, in a lot of images, it kind of has an appearance of a butterfly. It doesn't look like that in my picture, I know, but just bear with me. This area in the middle that again looks like a butterfly is referred to as gray matter because it's darker tissue. Now, what's important about that, and you'll notice, by the way, it's considered to be centrally located in the spinal cord. So picture we've cut the spinal cord, we're looking kind of top down at transverse section. Gray matter, okay, is where we find cell bodies, the neuron cell bodies, okay, and we will also find synapses. So anytime we have a nerve-to-nerve connection, right, we call that a synapse, we're going to find those in the gray matter. Now, what about this area outside, right, which we would consider more superficial? We're going to refer to this area as the white matter. Now, something I didn't mention about that myelinated axon a few minutes ago is that myelin is white. It's made of fat. So this white matter is all myelinated. Okay, it's all myelinated, and that means it has neurons that are fast moving. Okay, signals that are fast moving. So what does that mean? All of our tracks, which are our nerve pathways, okay, are in the white matter. So all of our pathways, and keep in mind, if we're looking inside the spinal cord is a vertical bundle of nerves, right? Or bundle of axons, if you want to think of it that way. All of the sensory pathways are going to be traveling up. We refer to all these pathways in the spinal cord as projection pathways. But all the sensory pathways should be traveling up, so we'll typically refer to those as ascending pathways. And of course, all the motor pathways, this is sensory, all the motor pathways will be traveling down. So keep that in mind as we're talking about pathways here, okay? The motor pathways will be descending, okay? Now, I'm not going to try to even attempt to draw anything with the brain, but keep in mind that the brain is going to be the exact same concept. We've got white matter and gray matter in the brain. White matter is going to be for the pathways, right? Because they're fast moving with that myelin, and gray matter is going to be for cell bodies and synapses, okay? Also keep in mind we have another video on the sensory and motor pathways, the ascending and descending pathways, where we map out the basic general somatic sensory and somatic motor pathways. You might want to take a look at that video as well. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to leave the whole gray matter, white matter thing up here. And what I'm going to talk about, actually maybe I will just erase this just to give us some more space, is we have a spinal nerve which is a mixed nerve. Now you say, well, what does that mean? We're going to talk about nerves for a minute here. Picture, I'm going to draw this here and use different colors to hopefully help with the visual. If we stack vertebrae, we look at vertebrae from the lateral sides, the outsides, we see little holes called intervertebral foramen. Your spinal nerves exit each level through the intervertebral foramen. Spinal nerve is referred to as a mixed nerve. What does that mean? It means we have both sensory and motor fibers inside the nerve. If the nerve were injured, which by the way, spinal nerves get injured all the time. Spinal nerves were injured, you could lose sensory loss, you could have sensory loss, you could have motor loss, or you could have both. Okay, because we have both axons located in a spinal nerve. So one of the things we're going to define real fast is what is a nerve, okay? Because a nerve, we're going to try to draw it real fast here. A nerve is the entire bundle, okay? So what does that mean? That means that inside here, especially if it's a mixed nerve, we're going to have a bunch of sensory fibers going one direction, and we'll have a bunch of motor fibers going the opposite direction. Again, what I mean by fibers is axons. And so the green in this case could be motor, it's going one direction. The blue could be sensory, going the opposite. Keep it in mind, motor and sensory information always goes opposite directions. Sensory is always headed where? Toward the spinal cord and then up toward the brain. Sensory is always incoming information. Motor is always outgoing information. So it's always away from the brain and then away from the spinal cord. Okay, we have another video on that. You could watch that, get some more information. But keep in mind, when we say neuron, we're talking about the axon, the cell body, and the dendrites. So we're talking about something that's on a cellular level. When we use the term nerve, we're talking about the entire bundle, something that's definitely seen with the naked eye. We can easily dissect. And we're talking about something that holds the entire axon, cell body, and of course, dendrite, if that makes sense. So the nerve would be a giant bundle. I always think of a nerve bundle similar to what I think of like a wiring harness on a car. If you open up the wiring harness, you see lots of different colored wires inside. That wiring harness would represent the nerve bundle, okay? The little colored wires inside would represent your sensory and motor fibers, okay? So this spinal nerve over here is a mixed nerve. So on the inside, it's going to look like this. It's going to have sensory fibers going into the spinal cord. And I want you to notice something, because this is what we're talking about right here. Sensory fibers go into the spinal cord and go into this area of the gray matter called the dorsal horn. Okay? The motor fibers are going to always be exiting the spinal cord, and they're going to come out of the gray matter through an area called the ventral horn. Okay? So that's another key concept. All the fibers are kind of mixed up together in our spinal nerve, which again is mixed. And so think of it again, right? All of the information, you know, in my arms and legs, and external part of my body's coming in through this sensory part of the spinal nerve, and of course all of the motor information that's leaving my spinal cord is going to my skeletal muscles through this motor side. So that's an important concept as well. Now, I don't want to get too much into my other video with the sensory and motor pathways, but just keep in mind that this motor pathway is going to go directly to a skeletal muscle. Okay. The last thing I want to show you is again, this is really a pretty good map of what we call the somatic sensory motor pathways, right? So somatic refers to the body. I always tell students to think of it more as your external part of your body. It's going to be dealing with things like skin, muscle, bone, and joint for the sensory side. And of course, on the motor side, it's going to be dealing exclusively with skeletal muscle. Now, if we're not dealing with somatic parts of the nervous system, what are we dealing with? We're dealing with visceral. So with the visceral side, I'm going to erase all this here. We're dealing with sensory from the organs, or we're dealing with motor to the organs. And again, our term for motor information to the organs would be visceral, right? Visceral motor information. We just talked about somatic motor. Talk about visceral motor for a minute. Our autonomic nervous system is our visceral motor control. It's our autonomic nervous system. And what I wanted to mention is that, of course, with the autonomic nervous system, we have a sympathetic side, and of course, we have a parasympathetic side. Okay? Our sympathetic side is going to be a little bit different. If we're looking at the spinal cord again, our neurons are going to leave the spinal cord through the gray matter, and they're not going to go directly to the organ. There's going to be one more synapse. So if we're looking at the sympathetic nervous system, we're going to have a short preganglionic neuron, and then we're going to have a long postganglionic neuron that will ultimately arrive and innervate an organ. So the difference is with what I was just showing you with lower motor neurons, those are motor fibers that go to skeletal muscle. It's just a direct connection from the spinal cord to the muscle. There is no synapse. With the autonomic nervous system, there is a synapse here, an extra synapse, basically on the way to the organ. So that gives us a pre and a postganglionic neuron. Okay, it gives us essentially two. So picture the spinal cord would be here. So the preganglionic neuron basically has its cell body in the gray matter, the spinal cord. Postganglionic cell body is going to be somewhere collaterally in the body, outside the spinal cord. Okay, so keep that in mind. The parasympathetic is the exact same concept, only it will start with a long preganglionic neuron and end with a short. So the exact opposite. Okay? Again, this cell body would be located in the spinal cord. Now we're going to do a whole nother video on the whole sympathetic, parasympathetic wiring and how it works, because it is more difficult to understand. But this wiring, okay, for the autonomic nervous system, this is one of the key things to remember, is that it's motor only. Okay, maybe I'll even put this: visceral motor only, meaning it's motor to the organs, because it's visceral, and it's motor only. Let me clean that up a little bit. Which means it is not a sensory system. It is motor control for the organs of the body, okay? And what kind of motor control is it? It is a regulatory motor control. It doesn't tell the organ to work. Good example is your heart's going to work with or without the sympathetic or parasympathetic divisions. What is it telling the heart to do? It's telling the heart to speed up, or it's telling the heart to slow down. Okay, it's regulatory control. The sympathetic side tends to ramp most organs up, not all, and we'll talk more about that in another video. And the parasympathetic side tends to calm things down. Okay, so we'll talk more about this, but I wanted to give some of the basic wiring. And again, we have another video on the sensory and motor pathways, but I wanted to give some basic wiring of how things work in the nervous system and define a few basic things, okay? So we're going to do more in another video. Stay tuned for the sympathetic and parasympathetic side. But for now, good luck and good study.